It's a strange title for it's not a political party. It's a pressure group, I suppose, within the Conservative Party. But it just conjures up, as soon as you say national conservatism, people think national socialism. And I can't think that's a good name for a group.
So I don't. But
you don't think that?
No. When I hear national conservatism, I don't think national socialism.
Well, I do, and it appalls me that they've given it this name.
But it's the phrase nationalism, isn't it, as well, Ian? And you could look at, say, the Scottish National Party and call them the Scottish Nationalists in Parliament a lot of the time. And nationalism generally has had a bad reputation or negative connotations in many cases, but in others they'll probably say there's a lot of positive things there as well in terms of pride and in terms of heritage and country and so on. And this is probably about debating about the balance there and where we stand with it, I think.
If you read reports of Suella Braverman's speech, they tend to concentrate on the fact that she was effectively criticising her own policies, which seems a bit odd for a Home Secretary to do.
I don't think it's necessarily criticising her policies, but she's in a situation where she's no doubt very frustrated. We look at things such as small boats. We'll talk about the culture wars quite a lot and reaffirming a lot of those things and things that you would talk about at not just a Conservative conference, but those with those values. And I think she's talking about really perhaps the frustration that's there and how hard work it is to actually get this across. And it's not just what's in government, of course. These are societal issues as well. And they're some of the things that conference explored. It's not just government. It's the wider society in Britain too.
Bell Ribeiro-Addy, Suella Braverman, far away.
Absolutely shocking speech. I thought it was absolutely awful. And, if the question is if you think the Conservatives will lose the next election, I'm quite sure they will. I think people are sick of them. It was clear, yes, she may have been putting forward her values, but she was clearly criticising the extent to which she's allowed to operate in the way that she does under her current Prime Minister. So she was clearly making a play, I think, for the Conservative leadership. And when they do lose the election, which I 100% believe they will because the country is sick of them, we'll see what happens.
Do you think she would have a chance of getting it?
I couldn't possibly tell you what the views of Conservative Party members are.
Brendan could, though. I mean, do you think that... let's say it was her, Kemi Badenoch, Penny Mordaunt maybe. Do you think she would stand a good chance?
Well, I think we're going to win the next general election, Ian. I'm the eternal optimist here. I think if you look at what's happened in 1992 and when we got the majority in 2015, there's a year and a half to go until the election. And I think this fatalistic idea... Well, we don't know yet.
Please tell me, because we have no idea.
Well, we'll have to see. But I mean, this kind of fatalistic idea that it's all a foregone conclusion, we're yet to see really, I think, what Labour actually stand for, what does Keir Starmer stand for, what are the actual policies and so on. So there is a long way to go there, and I think if Rishi Sunak can deliver and he's got those 5 pledges, I'm sure there'll be other things coming as well with that, then I still think we can actually do it.
How's it going on the 5 pledges?
Well, I think obviously the economy, I mean, some would say it's really 3 pledges, isn't it? One, which is looking at the economy, improving it, growing it, keeping inflation down, tackling the backlog, and then, of course, stopping the boats. So stopping the boats, of course, is a work in progress. We've put legislation through. We want to see the Rwanda scheme, the flights literally taking off there. And, of course, inflation is the big enemy to all of us at the moment, as we've seen with all the pay negotiations and so on. But I think we're moving in the right direction.
I'm not looking at Charlotte Proudman, but I can sense steam coming out of her ears.
Stop the boats. Stop the boats and the culture wars, as says Suella Braverman, is just a way of distracting from the real issues that people in this country are really struggling with, including, as you mentioned, inflation, rising food prices, high rates of unemployment. The NHS is in crisis. We've spoken about many of these issues before on the programme, but they're the issues that Suella Braverman is not necessarily speaking about, that she should be tackling along with her government, and are wholly failing people who are just trying to put a roof over their head, heat their homes, and are instead queuing up outside food banks. And I think it's absolutely appalling that the focus is on small boats, for goodness sake, with desperate people trying to get here, often fleeing places of persecution. And rather than helping them, as we owe a duty under the Refugee Convention, we're turning them away. And we're apparently going to ban people from claiming asylum in desperate need. I think it's a gross indictment of this government.
What do you make of the speech that that she's made to this conference, where most people, apart from Brendan, have interpreted it as her effectively saying, well, I may be Home Secretary, but I can't do anything. I'm not allowed to do anything.
Well, I think that's really interesting, because what it says to me is that this is a frightening prospect. If she can't do anything as Home Secretary, and she's done a hell of a lot, and I think she's done an awful lot of damage to this country, what would this country look like if she was Prime Minister? And I think that is what's a frightening prospect.
Freddie?
National Conservatism may be a bit of a weird name, and I can see why it puts people off, but I do actually think there's some interesting ideas going around there. It's the central debate on the right at the moment, I think, which is how assertive should government be? And a lot of people who call themselves Conservatives or part of the Conservative Party are basically liberals who think that government should step out the way. But that strange group, and they're not really coherent, they don't really agree with each other, I think, that did the conference over the past couple of days, they're arguing that government should be more assertive. They should say, these are our values, we are going to go and fight for them and impose them, basically. So the bits that everyone's got upset about in the Home Secretary's speech, I suspect if you did an opinion poll and quoted them at ordinary voters, they would not be as appalled as the people sitting around this table. That's not the bit that would put people off about this conference, to be tough on immigration and the rest of it. It's the more Christian elements that a lot of the MPs involved were talking about that suddenly, I think, whereas it's popular in America, they have a big Christian conservative vote. The national conservatism movement started there. There's this attempt to kind of import it into the UK. I'm very sceptical that it was actually going to get any traction here in the UK.
Just to expand on that a bit, because that's something I must admit I haven't picked up on. So sort of this whole group is some sort of Christian evangelical fundamentalist group.
Well, I wouldn't say that, but it was started by this Israeli Jewish political philosopher called Yoram Hazony, but he's leading this big movement in America that's got real traction. They're influencing some of the big presidential candidates in the Republican Party. And, you know, in America, there is a big Christian vote. And so it's a lot of real social conservatism, which is all about the family, about, you know, helping women stay at home to look after the kids instead of go out to work, you know, much tougher rules on the kind of woke culture war issues, those kind of things that play incredibly well in the US. And here it's a bit of an experiment, I think, to see whether people are going to sit up and listen when they hear these kind of things talked about. I think the UK is very, very different. And if you go hunting for those true social conservatives, there aren't that many of them.
Brendan, religion hasn't really played a huge role in British politics. I'm sure we can all think of areas where it might have done in the past, but at the moment, I mean, we all remember Alistair Campbell saying we don't do God, and generally that has been the case in British politics. Are you a bit sceptical about this development?
Well, I mean, some fair points there, and I speak as a former secondary school RE teacher, so there's a bit of a link there.
That,
So again, it's all this flag and faith thing, and again, if I was standing for politics in the United States, they would ask me which church I go to, and things that you would never dream of asking people over here because it just generally isn't an issue. I think if you actually look at the role of faith in this country, in terms of what our actual values are, then I think you can say that there is an influence there. There are some people who, whether you're Muslim, Christian, whether you're Jewish or so on, or whether you have no faith at all. I mean, there are all those little bits that are in there. Whether we're explicitly as religious as some are in the United States, I would probably question that, same as Freddie said. But in terms of politics, certainly the values are there, if not the actual religion part itself.
But when you look at what's happened to the Republican Party, really ever since the early 2000s, where effectively I would describe it now as not a political party, it's a quasi-religious sect. And that has put off moderate Republicans from supporting it.
Well, they're very fractured, aren't they, with the Republican Party? You'll get the Trump supporters, you have the evangelical side of it, there's the Tea Party movement, there's all the other sort of movements around there as well. And I think with the Conservative Party, we've always managed to be that broad church, really. And we'll mention about the more socially conservative side. You have other MPs coming in who will describe themselves as one nation. One nation can mean all sorts of things there. You have people who are more liberal, more libertarian. You have people who are more traditional centre-right or will be more socially conservative, as we say. So I think the trick is that you need to keep all of these people within the broad church, if you'll excuse the phrase there. And that's always been the strength of the Conservative Party. I think if we're too narrow and you lose that, that's how you lose elections. So we still need to be that party for everybody, I think.
There's broad church and then there's identity crisis, existential crisis. Who are we and what do we believe in? I think it feels to most people like that's where the British Conservatives are headed. In your defence, if you look over the pond, as we were just talking about, the Republicans are even more so. Last week we had Donald Trump doing a big town hall on CNN, which was much talked about, in which he was praising the new Supreme Court judgment about abortion, saying that he counts it as a huge victory. This is a guy whose personal morals are famously not exactly strict and who's never been anti-abortion his whole life. So over there, it is even more chaotic than here.
Well, that's a good start to the programme. We've got more subjects coming up. If you'd like to ask our panel a question, it's 0345 6060 973. It's 8:15.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
18 minutes past 8. Brendan Clarke-Smith is here, Conservative MP for Bassetlaw, Bell Ribeiro-Addy, Labour MP for Streatham. I was just asking about who was your predecessor, because I can't... Chuka-Ramuna. I mean, there's a name that we haven't heard for a long time. I expect you might have, Bell, but
no,
he was literally on LBC virtually every day for about 3 years, and now haven't seen him for years.
Anchor now.
Charlotte Proudman is here, human rights barrister, and Freddie Sayers, editor of UnHerd.com. Claire in Westminster is rarely unheard. She's going to be heard now. Hello, Claire.
Good evening, Iain and panel. And may I say, what an honour to speak to Belle. I hugely commend her for her efforts to get reparations for the African Holocaust. She's just amazing. Now we know officially that Brexit has failed, as highlighted by Nigel Farage and Anne Widdecombe. What are we going to do about it?
I'm not going to go to Brendan first again. Let's go to Belle first.
Well, I think the problem is the person who has said Brexit is failed wants it to go further, and everybody else who's feeling the effects of Brexit failing actually wants this nightmare to end. The reality of the situation is we can't just go back to Europe and say that we want in. That's not going to happen. So we are going to have to look for a way around it. But what the government are doing at the moment by throwing away all of the EU law, which I must point out is actually now become UK law. We embedded it into our legislation. So the idea that we're just going to blow it all out is it makes no sense at all. That's not the way forward. That's not going to lead to a closer relationship with what were our largest trading partners. We need to look forward, and maybe one day we will rejoin the EU. But you have to remember, we begged to get in the first place. They wouldn't make it so easy for us.
No, and Andrew Marr had a German SPT politician on his programme earlier who basically said there'll be no cherry picking. You'll accept it on our terms if you come back.
Absolutely, and we need to remember that we were given so many things to opt out of. We didn't join the single currency. There were so many different regulations that we were given the opportunity to opt out of. There were so many things that we were allowed to do. And then when we went to negotiate, we literally went to them and were just like, well, we're Britain. Give us what we want. That is not a way to negotiate, and that's why we got such a rubbish deal in the end, as far as I'm concerned.
Do you not think it's a little bit too early to judge? Nigel, this is being written up as Nigel Farage is saying Brexit has failed, but nobody's looking at the context.
Well, Bloomberg
surely we need to wait a little bit longer.
Bloomberg has predicted that it's losing us £100 billion a year. We are the only G7 country that hasn't seen an uptick since the pandemic in terms of our economy. Things are bad. Things are bad. And I get people saying, we've got to wait a few more years. But what more do we need to see? More crops rotting in the fields, more travel chaos, shortage of our workers being able to go over to the EU. What more do we need to see to believe that
Freddie
it's awful?
Sayers.
I'm going to try and make an argument for why Brexit has not failed. It's not going to be the normal one. And I should say I voted Remain and I'm not normally a big Brexit man, but I think if you zoom out a bit, the vote at the time was not about economics. The Remain campaign was all about economics, and people rejected it anyway. So I don't think anyone's surprised that it hasn't been a big economic boon. It was really a kind of rejection of globalisation. I think people felt that they didn't want to live in a kind of single world order where everything was the same and there were these big supernatural national organisations. They wanted things to be smaller, more national. And like it or loathe it, and I suspect most people around this table don't like it, the world feels a lot less globalised than it did in 2016. And you could say in some really quite frightening ways, but it's a completely unrecognisable world. The Brexit vote set in train a series of events. Obviously Trump came afterwards, but all sorts of populist governments. Suddenly we don't live in that hyper-globalised world anymore. People are much more national, and there's a lot of different types.
But economically we do.
I think that's the tension, and they never quite squared that. Nigel Farage, he goes on Newsnight and he says it's failed because the two things he wanted was less immigration and ultra Thatcherite free market policies for economics, and he's ended up with neither of them.
What about the view, Brendan, that economically, there have been, as I always put it, which really irritates people, quite a few bumps in the road, but it's not the fault of Brexit that this government has been so incompetent in implementing it, is it?
Well, I think you've got to look at the circumstances behind it, and what Freddie says, there's a cultural phenomenon to it as well as an economic one there. The same as taking back control is not just about immigration. You look at people gluing themselves to roads or whatever. It's more of an idea as well, and it goes further than that. But Brexit, I always say, it's not a switch that you flick overnight and suddenly it's happened. It's a process, and it's a process that can take a very long time. It will develop, and it will develop over time, the same as the EU did when it was originally the coal and steel community. If you look at what it started as with the Benelux countries and moved out, the EU evolved over quite a long period of time, same as Brexit will. Now, OK, we can point to things such as the pandemic and to say that that's caused issues, and some of the successes so far, like the trade deals we're signing or over the vaccines or so on. And I think the best is still to come here. But with Nigel Farage, I don't think he was saying that Brexit has failed. But as we said,
we did actually use those words.
But his version of Brexit, how he would like to see it. I don't think Nigel would like to reverse the Brexit vote.
But, the fact that there are these 4,000 regulations that are still there, we left in January 2020, so they've been there for 3 years. Why on earth has nothing been done to get rid of... I was watching Nadine Dorris's programme the other night, and she was really slagging off Rishi Sunak for, in 6 months, well, he hasn't done anything on this. And I'm thinking, yeah, but you were a cabinet minister under a government led by Boris Johnson, the guy who got Brexit done, in inverted commas, and none of these regulations were abolished then. So why get so exercised about it now?
Well, this is the thing. I think if you bear in mind, we may not necessarily disagree with all of those. Some of them might be fairly simple things. There's a fair amount of consensus on whether it's about
nobody has suggested that all 4,000 were just going to be got rid of.
That's what some people were saying.
I'd like to see the evidence for that.
Well, this is the balance, isn't it? And this is why I think there's a delivery issue in. You can sometimes overpromise, and I think the number of regulations, as you unpick it, they sometimes become more and more, and you realise you've got a deadline, you've got all the departments to do it, and really is it a more sensible approach to actually reassure people and say that if there's a regulation that we don't like, we can actually get rid of that and we can take it away because we have taken back control. Now, I'm more bothered about that than looking at all 4,000 of them, getting rid of them all of a sudden and saying, oops, actually, yeah, we agreed with 200 or 300 of those, maybe we should have kept them. So I want it done properly, I want it done over a sensible amount of time. If we could get it done within the time limits, great, but if we can't, let's not make a mess of it, let's do it properly, and let's pick out the things that we actually do want to get rid of and not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
But you said that you said that we'd got Brexit done, or Boris had got Brexit done.
That's what he claimed.
And Brendan is saying that it's a process, so we're still doing it. Which one is it?
How long is it going to take? Are we going to be saying this in 10 years' time? We need to get Brexit done. I mean, I don't know about anyone else around this table, but I am sick of hearing about Brexit. And I don't mean to trivialise the issue, because I know the significant impact that it has on ordinary people's lives, and including the law as well, as lawyers going into court and looking at how the regulations are changing, albeit very slowly. But, in November last year, YouGov did a poll, and it was around 56% of people said they would not vote for Brexit. They were opposed to it. So I think that if we were perhaps to have another vote now or in the near future, just to say, if we were, as a Remainer, as a staunch Remainer, I think we get a very different result now. But my concern is actually what the damage that has been done as a result of Brexit, the damage caused by the narrative and the discourse around who is British, and the types of xenophobic and at times, frankly, hostile, racist language that was used to support Brexit, and the hostility that's been caused as well to migrants and many European citizens living here that then felt that this was no longer their home, those that wanted to make Britain their home as a result. And, I think that that's going to cause long-lasting damage.
But nearly 6 million did. We thought it was 3 million, but it turned out to be something like 5.8 million. And they are still here. They've got settled status. And, I think that the whole... I accept there was a very divisive debate that went on.
It really
not particularly in the referendum. I thought that campaign wasn't so divisive, but it was actually in the 2 years afterwards that it became a really, really nasty, horrible debate. And I think things were said by people that shouldn't have been said or even thought, but they were. And it's quite difficult to go back from that. Yeah. But I think we have surely entered a much calmer period now in this debate.
Well, I don't think we have. I mean, the question that you asked earlier about Suella Braverman, the types of rhetoric that has come out as a result of her potentially launching a leadership bid, and no doubt part of that may be a more staunch, hard Brexit. Who knows? I'm just hypothesising. Freddie said, though, that actually Brexit could be a rejection of globalisation, and maybe we've now arrived at a position where we feel that we're more nationalistic in terms of our ideology, potentially living a smaller type of life, I think you put it, or something like that, a smaller type of world that we're in now. I don't think that's the case at all. I think it's a myth. We're still in a globalised country. We have social media, we're able to travel at the moment still freely, albeit if you want to spend longer time in Europe, you need a visa, so it makes it more difficult. But our lives generally haven't changed significantly. Globalisation is here to stay. And I think that, feeding this myth is what's got us, I think, into this real difficult situation I think we need to sort of backtrack out of. And I don't know how we do that, aside from a Labour government that's going to support potentially another referendum.
But that's not going to happen, is it, Belle?
Well, you tell us, Belle. Is that going to happen?
That's far above my pay grade. But as somebody who voted against a deal, I think we need to have a proper conversation about Brexit, which is aside from all of the awful rhetoric that you've just heard about, and if that conversation leads to some sort of vote, then fine. But I do not believe that we should have ever put this to a referendum. I don't believe the country...
You don't trust the people?
No, not because I don't trust the people, because I don't think it's right to run the country by referendum, by literally asking one question, yes or no.
How many referenda were there under the last Labour government? Quite a few, weren't there?
I don't know. I don't know. To be quite honest, I'll be honest with you. I have no idea how many there were, but I don't care.
Referendums,
I do not think it's the way to run a country.
Switzerland and New Zealand are both effectively governed by referendums, and in lots of American states, every November they will have a statewide referendum on particular issues. What's wrong with them?
It's also about the culture.
Just because you didn't get the answer you wanted?
No, not at all. Because think about it. As you've heard, if we ran the question again, we'd get a different answer. And how many different times are we going to run the question? I think it's just not the way to do it, because you cannot make an informed choice of yes or no. We don't live our lives in black and white. That's not how things work. And if you cannot give people the full information and then they turn around and say, actually, you didn't tell me X, Y or Z, or you can't be clear about exactly what's going to happen, it just doesn't work. Okay. If we give people a referendum right now on whether or not they wanted the death penalty, you probably find a lot of people like, yes, kill the criminals, kill them all. Is that something that we'd go about doing?
Especially with
I
the
think that was a yes to your question of whether there should be another referendum.
No, it wasn't necessarily. I was saying that if the conversation, we need to have a proper conversation, an informed conversation, and if that did lead to one, then that'd be something that'd be something that'd be up to the country. But I do not believe that the country should be run by referendum.
Well, let's put it a different way. Do you think, though, then that Keir Starmer should show a bit of real leadership and said, OK, look, we can see the effects of Brexit. It's an absolute disaster. If I become Prime Minister, I'm going to take us back into the EU. That would be real leadership, wouldn't it?
But you know what? Nobody can just get up and say, and this is what I was saying earlier, we can't just get up and say we're going to go back into the EU. Who thinks they're just going to sit there and say, welcome back, folks? It's just not going to happen. We begged to get in. We made them angry when we left. It wouldn't be that easy a route.
Okay.
It's such a complex issue as well, and it's boiled down to either in or out. You just need to make a strong political statement, and then that's the end of it. And one of the other issues to look at as well is the impact that it's had upon Scotland, and potentially Scotland leaving the UK as they would like to do, or the SNP.
I think the prospect of that happening now is less than it has been for 20 years.
The rhetoric, though, that came about as a result of Brexit caused a lot of damage between the relations of England, Wales, Scotland.
Well, you could say that the rhetoric that came out of the 2014 referendum caused an equal amount of divisiveness. I mean, if we remember the horrible things that were said during that. Listen, we've got to move on to another subject in a minute, but let's get the news headlines first at 8:32 with Tim Daly.
Britain and the EU have agreed to strengthen their cooperation on migration. Downing Street says it will see a new working arrangement between British agencies and the European Border and Coast Guard. A serving member of the Metropolitan Police has been charged with rape. Thames Valley Police say PC Callum Utley will go before magistrates in High Wycombe in Buckinghamshire on Thursday. And rivers which have been swollen by days of heavy rain have flooded some towns in northern Italy. In Venice, the authorities there are preparing to activate a mobile barrier to protect it from a high tide flooding. LBC weather, showers easing in the north and east this evening, but largely dry overnight with a low of 2 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
Brendan Clarke-Smith, Belle Ribeiro-Addy, Charlotte Proudman and Freddie Sayers with us answering your questions. The number to call 0345 6060 973. Here's an email question from Ian who says, what would the panel do to stop the supermarkets from profiteering at the moment? They have so much money available now that you're going to see unprecedented promotions from them to win more market share. Look at Tesco setting club card only prices, and now Sainsbury's doing the same for Nectar card holders. I must admit, in the rare occasion I do supermarket shopping, it really infuriates me if I go into Tesco's and there's sort of two different prices.
I find myself fiddling around on my phone trying to pull up the app to get it to scan so I can get, No,
I just go to another supermarket. They lose my business because it annoys me. Right, let's go to Charlotte.
I'm going to ask a provocative question. I know that might surprise you, Ian. What do you think?
I have read your Twitter feed.
How about nationalising supermarkets?
Oh boy.
Belle Ribeiro-Addy, this is your chance to prove your socialist credentials.
Well, do you know what? I think at the moment we're in a really, really shocking situation where we're seeing people having to rely on food banks, and a lot of the supermarkets themselves are providing food donations. I don't think it's right that they're making this level of profit in the same way that gas companies shouldn't be making this level of profit. There is enough food in this country for everybody. It's just that it's not getting to the right people. So nationalising them, I'm not really sure about that. But nationalising the situation in which we're making sure that everybody gets the food that we need.
You see, that was me thinking you were down the line Corbynista who'd nationalise anything.
No, I wouldn't nationalise everything. Why does everybody think that socialism is about nationalising everything?
Because it traditionally has been.
No. Socialism does point to a situation where we nationalise the things, public utilities. Absolutely.
Surely the provision. I mean, I'm obviously playing devil's advocate, but you could argue that the provision of food. I mean, that is kind of a utility, isn't it?
And people should have a right to food. In fact, my colleague Ian Byrne in Liverpool has actually just sparked a whole movement in terms of a right to food. A right to food should be enshrined in law. But that doesn't necessarily mean...
How on earth do you do that?
There are many different ways around it. I mean, we know, for example, that we grow enough food in this country, and we know that we have the resources to make sure that everybody in this country has what they need in terms of food. And it's the same way as a universal basic income, I would say, making sure that everybody has what they need to eat. That doesn't mean that you can't go to Tesco's and pick up something from Tesco's finest range, let's say, on your own dime.
Such a champagne socialist, aren't you?
Tesco's finest, yes, that's right. Champagne socialist.
But, I mean, Charlotte, I assume you weren't being 100% serious with that suggestion.
I was thinking about food banks, and obviously we've seen enormous growth of them, and in a way, that is the nationalisation of food, isn't it? It's making food freely available to communities, but it's not necessarily provided for.
But it's not being run by
government.
I can't imagine anyone running a food service.
I agree with you. It's not exactly provided by the state, it's provided by communities, or it's provided by charities, third sector. No, I hear you. But imagine if that was, say, provided by the state. So there were places that people could go to that are on welfare benefits and below the poverty line, which I think should be a hell of a lot higher, but there we have it. And they could go to these places and access not just tinned food, which is often what's available at food banks, but fresh produce. So everybody, as Belle said, had access to fresh food, and they didn't need to queue up in undignified ways outside food banks. The children reliant on free school meals when they can access them, but instead everyone had an at least basic standard of food provision. And we all see now in Sainsbury's and Tesco's, they have a big box normally at the entrance or the exit when you're leaving, and you can put in food so that then that's distributed to food banks or people that need it and so forth, and you can access it.
That's the right way to do it then.
Yeah, but also, why is it left to customers to top up the provision of food outside?
You're given the chance to
Sainsbury's or Tesco, for example, could provide food, couldn't they? If they're making
a huge
profit, why don't they contribute?
And are they paying their fair share of tax? Probably not.
And are they paying a fair share of salary as well to people that work?
Are they paying farmers properly? That's a
question. Yeah, it's a good question.
So many questions, Freddie.
I got another question to add to the question mix.
We're supposed to be proud of the answers here.
We're talking about special prices for club cards, and actually the thing that worries me is all of this data that these supermarkets are collecting and all these huge corporates are collecting. They want you to take the club card price so that you can sign up to their scheme and they can track everything you buy across all platforms. And they're getting these enormous amounts of information about everyone. I think a growing proportion of people are really worried about that. They don't want their choices to be dictated for them by huge corporations.
It's no different to visiting websites and suddenly an advert comes up for something that you might have viewed on another website 10 minutes ago.
That's a good point.
It's the same principle, isn't it?
Yeah, people don't like that either.
I'm not sure they care about that as much as they do club cards.
But do they have the club cards so that they can access your data? So if it's running in the background of your phone and you have your location setting on, they know where you are, they know how close you are to a Tesco, they know how frequently you're going to, they know how much money you're spending in Tesco, and they also know how to target. And target you with the advertisements as well. You know, I always think it's quite frightening. I'm sorry, I'm going off topic.
You should have been to the National Conservatism Conference. They would have liked this a lot.
You know, when you speak, when you're sort of chatting away, as we're probably doing now, and then you talk about something really obscure, and then you find that an advert comes up on your phone 10 minutes later for that.
Creepy.
It's very scary.
It's frightening, isn't it? Anyway, that's
we all agree about that. There we go.
Brendan.
We do this in politics, though.
Can you give this answer without asking another question, please?
Sure. Well, this is what we do, targeting, and we target voters particularly, people who are more likely to vote for you. You look at certain age groups and things, and you look at knocking on certain doors. Politicians have been doing this. And people do surveys on all sorts of things, and that's what happens in the world. It is marketing, and the nature of marketing's changed. But in defence of supermarkets, they pay a lot of tax, they employ a lot of people. We have people like Morrison's in my constituency do some really great community work, give lots of things to charity as well. And also it's the free market. If you want cheaper food and if you want to combat the effects of inflation, then you need that competition in the market to do that. Now,
do you not think they've been profiteering over the past year or so? There is no way that some of the things that they've put up by 50, 100% should have been put up by that much.
Well, that's the thing. You can buy something from somewhere else, and that's the whole point of... I want people to make a profit. I don't want government to have to step in because they're making big losses and then they're not paying any tax or so on. So making profits is not a bad thing. I think if you're profiteering and you're taking advantage, I think the way farmers are treated sometimes...
Well, just on that, there's another text question here on this from Will in Crediton, who says, would the panel agree that supermarkets need to be legislated to pay farmers more for their produce and the margin they're able to make capped on raw products like eggs and meat? I'm a sheep farmer and the amount we're getting for produce hasn't increased despite our production costs spiralling. Farms will go bankrupt without help. Now, obviously, Will is speaking in self-interest there, but you look at any product that farmers are producing at the moment, milk, whether it's eggs or anything, they are not being paid a fair price by the supermarkets. Is that something the government should step in on?
Well, I'd encourage all supermarkets to pay a fair price, and again, the free market.
Should they be made to?
It's a fine balance. You don't want to get it to the stage where it affects the consumer and people are paying rocketingly high prices with inflation again because you've artificially inflated that. So I think really if you've got to make sure they are getting a fair price. You have supermarkets who have loss leaders on things like alcohol as well. You don't want it to get to the stage where, of course, you're having milk and eggs and basic things are not available. And we've seen during the pandemic when things disappear off the shelves, it's the first thing people go for.
Well, that's happening now. I mean, if you go into supermarkets, there's often no cucumbers, there's no tomatoes, sometimes there's no bread, and we see people posting pictures, I'm one of them, on Twitter, showing the fact there's just no fresh produce available. What are you doing about that?
What time do you go to the supermarket?
I have. I once went to 5 supermarkets to find tomatoes and cucumbers. Nothing. What are you doing about that?
Heinz baked beans, Heinz baked beans. Say the price has shot up at that, and people say, this tin has gone up by 50% or whatever. Buy the Tesco value one.
No, but
they don't taste the same.
But if they don't
you can't have baked beans that aren't Heinz.
But I just want to point out that Brexit has helped none of this. It hasn't helped the farmers, hasn't helped the prices in the supermarket.
But I don't think it's hindered as much as, shall we say, some people say it has.
I think it has, and also we need to point out the fact that a lot of the time farmers, it's actually cheaper for them because they can't get the people to help pick the crops to plough what they've got back back into the ground. It's cheaper to do that than to harvest it.
It's a real problem.
We're wasting a
real
lot
problem
of
in Streatham, isn't it?
And to sound like
That's
an
not the
environmentalist.
point. We live in a country where, you know, we have farmers, and it's really important that we support British produce, and we can't do that in the economic situation we're in at the moment.
Well, it's actually really good to hear from an inner city MP saying that, because I think sometimes there's this real divide between people who live in big cities and they have no comprehension about what goes on in the rural economy.
Yeah,
so,
and eating out of season as well, Ian. You know, people wanting things all the way through the year, and you look at the environmental impact of that as well, and talking about growing more things in your community and so on. So there is a real genuine argument there about your local communities and your local environment as well.
No, she's going to be telling us to eat turnips.
Yeah.
Well, but this is the thing, you know. It's all the
all these people wanting.
I don't think I've ever had a turnip. Not knowingly, anyway. Right, some very good answers on that. Thank you very much indeed. Keep your calls coming at 0345 6060 973. It's 8:46.
New to LBC.
It's Colin Brazier on LBC.
Nights from 10.
If you want to be a caller again, don't impute my motives if you don't know what they are.
Colin Brazier.
I took a life. I deserve to be inside.
On your radio.
We need skilled people who will fill those holes in our labour market.
On Global Player.
You brought this conversation up this evening, and it brought so much back.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973. Brendan Clarke-Smith, Bell Ribeiro-Addy, Charlotte Proudman and Freddie Sayers with us answering your questions. I'm going to do what I did last night and tell you what the final fun text question is going to be, which has now disappeared off the bottom of my screen, I see. It's from Jennifer in Leeds. Some actual good news today with the results of reading tests in primary school. Kids in England have improved significantly. So what was your favourite book when you were a child? Love to get your
views on that on the text 84850. Your favourite book as a child, and if it isn't The Magic Faraway Tree, I don't know what's wrong with you. Right, let's go to another text question from Frankie in Bridlington. Would it be better for Labour and the Lib Dems to come out and admit that they'd form a coalition if they needed to, rather than letting us assume that they're doing backroom deals instead? Freddie Sayers.
Do you remember 2015? Feels like a long time ago now, but that's when the first talk of coalition of chaos came out, and the fear then was that Labour was going to be in coalition with the SNP, and it was very effective. People really didn't like it. They thought this is unstable, and they just had the coalition with Clegg. They didn't like that much, and it was really effective. Now, I'm not so sure. I think after the Tory chaos of the past few years, I think people are much more accepting of the possibility of a coalition. So I think, speaking as a recovering pollster, I would say Labour to talk about anything to do with the SNP in coalition is going to put people off left, right and centre, because it opens the whole can of worms about Scottish nationalism, and you should run a mile from it. As for the Liberal Democrats, people barely remember what they're like, so I think there's not much danger there.
Charlotte?
I would be really interested to see a coalition between Labour and the Lib Dems, particularly when it comes to political compromises on some of the big issues like proportional representation, for example. The Lib Dems, of course, supporting that. I'm not clear what Keir's stance is, but I assume he'll probably be against it. And I wonder how issues such as that, as well with the House of Lords, and Lib Dems still oppose the House of Lords and want either to reform or abolish it. So I think it'd be interesting to look at some of the constitutional issues and look at how they could potentially compromise. I think potentially it's a good way forward for both. I mean, I'm a Labour Party supporter. It's time we got rid of the Conservatives, and if that means a coalition, then so be it. They did extremely well in the local elections. I think it's viable.
It's quite ironic, though, isn't it, that Ed Davey today on LBC said that he regards his primary objective as getting rid of the Conservatives, and yet he was one of the Lib Dems in 2010 that enabled the Conservatives to go into government.
But he also said, didn't he, that when he was in government, he did the best that he could as well to also defeat some of the government policies as well. Yeah, that's what he said.
Like privatising the post office?
No, I totally agree with you. I'm just saying that's sort of what he was suggesting when he was spoken to. So it's interesting how he sort of changed his tack now. I listened to that interview. I thought very strategic in the way that he is putting his potential coalition between the two of them.
Ed Davey is happy to get on the airwaves. There was a recent poll a few weeks ago of how many people could recognise him from a picture. It was 12% of the population. So he's got a long way to go before the election. I think
that's higher than the Liberal Democrat vote share.
That's true.
Or not in the local elections.
That is true.
They did rather well in the local elections. Brendan Clarke-Smith, let's come to you on this. People have said to me that whenever I interview Conservative politicians, I should be asking them about coalitions as well, because if I ask it to Labour and Lib Dems, why not the Conservatives? And I say, because there is no prospect of a Conservative coalition with anybody. Is there?
No, not really. I think one of the interesting things I saw this week on the polling for this as well, that a lot of Labour voters were more comfortable with a coalition with the Liberal Democrats than they were with an outright Labour government. I found that very surprising as to why many feel that. I think it was a Times poll. I may be wrong, but I'll double check.
Our regular Labour Party.
But again, and this is part of the point, really, and from our perspective, if you did have that coalition, and we'll talk about coalitions of chaos or whatever, we spoke about, Charlotte raised about proportional representation. I think we're more worried about votes for 16-year-olds, votes for EU nationals or non-EU nationals, potentially. That's something that's been floated in the press this week. And will you ever see a majority Conservative government again if the two of those get in and want to do that, if they want to change our system? Now, personally, for me, I agree with what Robert Buckland said. If you have major constitutional changes like that, they need to go to a referendum, actually, and you need to be doing that, not just...
More referendums.
Well, there you go. But on these where it's a binary issue, I think it's a bit different. But certainly from a Conservative perspective, I want to see a Conservative government. There's nobody really I want to be in coalition with either. I want us to have our own policies. We're not like on the continent. I think we benefit from the first past the post system and having those strong governments. That's what people want. They want a strong government, and I think we're the only ones really that are going to have the policies to do that.
Would you describe the government since 2019 as strong?
Well, I think it's very difficult with everything that's happened to us. We've had the pandemic, we had the fallout from Brexit, and then, of course, we've now on our third Prime Minister as well with some of the internal problems. So certainly it's been difficult. I still think we can deliver on that, and we can deliver on the manifesto, and that's something Rishi Sunak's been really, really keen on. So I think sort of the challenge has been thrown down to us. We've probably got a year and a half to actually show people that we're actually doing what we've been voted in to do. I don't think everything we've done over that period has been negative. I think the support we've provided people, there's a lot of genuinely good things that this government has been doing as well. But at the same time, yeah, it's going to be difficult. It's going to be a challenge, and that's really what we've got to show people.
Belle, are you looking forward to coalescing with Ed Davey?
Well, no, I wouldn't be looking forward to coalescing with Ed Davey. As to whether or not the Labour Party would actually make that decision, that is one that is far above my pay grade.
But you have an opinion.
I have an opinion, and my opinion is that we cannot forget that in 2010, it was the Lib Dems that literally gave the keys to the Conservative Party to number 10. They did that. And, you know, some people say if you're going to sell out big. What did they sell out for? Deputy Prime Minister and a few cabinet roles in which they were completely...
They had 5 cabinet ministers plus Nick Clegg, and they got 75% of their manifesto implemented. I'd say from their point of view, that was quite successful.
I don't think it was successful.
It was.
Because all they've done is...
75%,
well, they claim that. All they've done now is turn... And they U-turn on some of their huge promises. All they've done now is turn around and criticise everything they've done and try to make people forget that they are the reason why we are here right now.
Do you not think
they are the reason why we had the Conservative government in the first place? And do you know what? I agree. People are going to do whatever they have to get rid of the Tories. So there may be a coalition. Who knows? But as to whether or not I'm looking forward to it...
But do you think Freddie's right that the mood in the country has changed now, and that after the tumult of the last 6 or 7 years, maybe voters might think, well, actually it'd be quite good if two parties got together and we all calmed down a bit?
I'm not necessarily sure of that analysis personally. All I'm saying is I can't forget what they did, but I'm sure that everybody will be looking to do whatever they need to do to get the Tories out.
OK, let's go to our final question. Let me just remind you what it was. It's from Jennifer in Leeds. Some actual good news today with the results of reading tests for primary school kids in England improving significantly. I think we're now the 4th best in the world, best in Europe. So what was your favourite book when you were a child? Child, I guess, is anything up to the age of 16. Belle.
That goes quite far. I was thinking of quite young, so I came up with Spotted Dog books.
At 16?
They were always good fun, and no, not at 16. I'll have you know, I had a very high reading.
Still good fun, though. It's still
good fun. But no, I love Spotted Dog when I was learning how to read.
Brendan.
My little one's just on his Key Stage 1 SAT, so I've been doing a lot of reading with him, and I absolutely loved it. My early book, probably Fungus the Bogeyman. I don't know if anybody remembers that one. It was a bit of a disgusting one, and then I graduated to Stephen King books pretty quickly, so probably explains where I am now, actually.
Freddie.
Yeah, this probably explains where I am as well. The two authors that came to mind. You get trigger warnings for both of them now. Roald Dahl, Twits, Fantastic Mr. Fox, and also Enid Blyton. Those old-fashioned famous 5, Secret 7.
Magic Faraway Tree.
You get a warning now saying, "Be careful. This is upsetting for children."
It is upsetting for children. It was upsetting for me as a child. Deeply distressed. No, I'm kidding. Tracy Beaker for me. I thought it was a fantastic book. No, not come across that one.
And I have.
Explains why I'm doing family law. Let's just put it at that.
I always remember as a teenager reading James Herbert books, which you would, if you haven't ever read any, if you like Stephen King, you'd probably like James Herbert, sort of real horror, but taking places in places that I'd actually visited in Epping Forest. And The Fog and The Rats, could highly recommend them. Got all my sex education from The Fog. But sadly, we've run out of time to discuss that at length. Thank you very much indeed to all of you for taking part in the programme. Brendan Clarke-Smith, Belle Ribeiro-Addy, Charlotte Proudman and Freddie Sayers. Coming up in a moment, we're going to return to a subject which we do talk about on this programme quite a lot, and it's gambling addiction. And I think it is important to talk about. And I'm always struck by the number of people that phone in these phone-ins who've got the most horrifying experiences, and I think we all learn from that. But the rumour is that the gambling white paper, which the government has been promising for some time, or parts of it are going to be delayed. And I'm wondering what the effect of that will be on your life, because the aim of it is to regulate the gambling industry a little bit more strongly than it has been for the last